My husband's mother called me just the babysitter, so I sent her the daycare bill. My name is Jessica Beal. I'm 35 years old, a former communications director at an education nonprofit, and currently a full-time mother to twin toddlers who believe I hung the moon 3 years ago. I was managing a cross-regional team, building education campaigns for underfunded communities, and traveling between Denver and D.C. every month. I loved what I did. It was exhausting, sometimes thankless work, but it felt meaningful. I used to wake up with purpose, and I never imagined that walking away from it, even temporarily, would be the one thing my mother-in-law used against me the most. Brandon and I found out I was pregnant on a Thursday morning I will never forget. We had just finished remodeling the upstairs bathroom ourselves and were still peeling paint chips off the soles of our feet when that second pink line appeared. We weren't trying, but we weren't not trying either. What we hadn't expected was twins. Olive and Caleb came into the world 2 months early after a high-risk pregnancy that landed me in and out of the ER more times than I can count. I had to stop working by my 3rd trimester. At first, I thought I'd be back after 6 months, maybe 9. I held on to that hope like it was a deadline I could control. But the moment they were born, fragile and wired up in the NICU, something inside me rewired. I stopped thinking about campaign launches and strategic messaging and started obsessing over oxygen levels, ounces gained, and whether or not Caleb's left eye was tracking properly. When we finally brought them home, I knew there was no going back, not yet. Brandon made more money than I did. He was a project engineer at a firm with government contracts, and we were fortunate to have savings. So we sat down and made the kind of spreadsheet you make when you're trying to be responsible grown-ups. It told us what I already knew in my gut. I would stay home, and I would make it work. The first time Teresa visited, the twins were 5 months old. She had retired that spring from 3 decades of teaching high school English and had recently moved into a townhouse 30 minutes from us. She brought gifts wrapped in department store paper and a bottle of wine I couldn't drink. I remember the way she looked at me when I answered the door, smiling. But scanning, I had clipped my hair back with one of Caleb's pacifiers hanging off my shirt collar, and I was holding Olive, who had just spat up down my arm. She gave me that look, the one where people are deciding whether to compliment or critique. I tried to pretend I didn't notice. We had prepared her favorite meal, which took me 5 hours between feedings and diaper changes, but she barely touched it at dinner. She turned to Brandon and said, "You must be exhausted, doing everything on your own while Jessica's on maternity leave." I remember the sound of the fork pausing midair. I looked at her, then at Brandon, who just smiled awkwardly and changed the subject. It was the first time I heard her frame my decision not as a choice, but as an absence of responsibility. I told myself it was generational, that she didn't mean it the way it sounded, that she'd come around. I gave her the benefit of the doubt, because that's what people like me do when they're still trying to earn their place in a family that doesn't fully accept them. But the comments didn't stop. They got quieter, sharper, and more frequent at first. I try to respond politely, with data or humor or patience. But the thing about quiet insults is they're rarely heard by others. And even when you repeat them, they never sound as cutting as they felt in the moment. Kids need real structure, not just love, she said once, as I was teaching Olive to stack blocks. Another time, she asked Brandon if we were looking into preschools yet, then turned to me and added, "I just don't want them behind when you eventually go back to work." Eventually, like this wasn't work, like I wasn't already doing more than full-time hours with no PTO, no benefits, and no adult interaction most days. Still, I tried. I let her visit every Sunday. I included her in birthdays. I texted her photos. I asked for her advice, even when I didn't want it, and when she came over with unsolicited toys and educational games. I thanked her. I folded her judgments into the background like ambient noise, because I thought that's what good daughters-in-law do. I kept telling myself it would change, until one afternoon, I walked into the living room with sliced apples for the kids and overheard her on the phone with a friend, saying, "Brandon works himself to the bone, and she just plays house all day. I mean, I love the twins, but she's basically just their babysitter, not their mother, not Brandon's wife, just the babysitter." That was the day something in me stopped hoping. After that afternoon, I began noticing the weight of her words more clearly, like someone had finally wiped the fog from the mirror. Every Sunday visit came with comments that used to land softly, but now stung with precision. "The house always smells like formula," she remarked one weekend as I handed her a coffee. "I suppose not everyone has time to cook from scratch these days." Another Sunday, as I sat cross-legged on the floor, trying to get Olive to identify colors, Teresa leaned back on the couch and said, "You know, there are professionals who specialize in early development. Sometimes love isn't enough." She said it as if she were reciting an inspirational quote, but it wasn't inspiring. It was undermining. She always made sure her tone was light enough to be denied, but deliberate enough to land the hit. I tried talking to Brandon about it again. This time, I rehearsed what I would say in the shower beforehand, made sure I had examples and spoke calmly. He listened, or at least pretended to. Then he did what he always did. He brushed it off with that familiar phrase, "She doesn't mean anything by it. I used to believe that." But now, it felt like I was being gaslit by both of them. I started keeping track of her comments, not in a notebook or a spreadsheet, but in the part of my mind reserved for things you don't want to forget but wish you could. At night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, and replay her words, trying to decide if I was overreacting. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was imagining the malice. But then, I'd remember her voice when she called me just the babysitter, and the doubt would dissolve into something colder, something heavier. By the time the twins turned 2, we had fallen into a routine that looked calm from the outside, but was filled with quiet resentment beneath the surface. I kept our home running like a machine. Meals were planned, laundry rotated with the precision of an assembly line, and every inch of our schedule was accounted for. But inside, I felt like I was losing parts of myself. There were days I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. I didn't resent my children. I adored them, but I resented how invisible I had become in every room except theirs. The tipping point came the weekend before Easter. Teresa had decided to host a brunch at our place without asking. She called it a family contribution and invited Brandon's siblings, their spouses, and a few distant cousins I had met only once, she told Brandon, who told me 2 days before the event. I spent all Friday and Saturday prepping with the twins hanging on my legs, ignoring the throbbing in my lower back and the fact that I hadn't had a full night's sleep in weeks. I baked everything from scratch because I knew she'd notice if I didn't. I even ironed cloth napkins because she once said, "Paper napkins send a message." She never clarified what that message was, but I got the point. Sunday morning, she arrived early, as always, and immediately took over. She rearranged my table settings, swapped my quiche for one she'd bought from a bakery, and changed the playlist I'd curated the night before. She told me I had a good heart, but no eye for hosting. That afternoon, in front of the whole family, she told a story about how she used to teach full-time while raising Brandon and Evelyn, all while cooking dinner every night and volunteering for the school PTA. Some women today think staying home is a full-time job, she said with a smile. But I always believed in doing it all. People laughed politely. I stared down at my coffee cup, counting to 10. Evelyn gave me a look across the room. Sympathy, maybe, or guilt, but she said nothing. That night, while cleaning alone in the kitchen, I found myself scrubbing a pan that was already clean. The laughter from the living room echoed down the hall. I stood there motionless, sponge in hand, wondering how many more Sundays I would spend proving myself to someone who had already made up her mind. I had done everything she asked, smiled through insults, opened my home, cooked, cleaned, organized, accommodated, and still, in her eyes, I was just the babysitter. That label had burrowed itself into my skin, and no matter how many meals I made or milestones I captured on camera, I couldn't scrub it off. I wasn't looking for applause, but I had hoped for acknowledgement, for someone to say, "I see you." That moment didn't come, not from Brandon, not from anyone. So I stood there, in a house I kept running like clockwork, with dishes drying beside me and a quiet ache in my chest that felt like the beginning of something I couldn't name yet. There's a strange kind of loneliness that settles in when even your silence feels invisible. That night, after everyone left, I sat in the dark beside the twins' crib and watched them sleep, their breath steady, their small fists curled like they were still holding on to something I had forgotten how to ask for. I didn't cry. I didn't vent to Brandon. I didn't send passive-aggressive texts to friends who no longer asked how I was doing. I just sat there and felt the cold truth that no one else seemed to see the work I was doing. And for the first time, I stopped trying to convince them. That quiet decision didn't look like rebellion, but it was the beginning of one. The next morning, I opened my laptop and typed economic value of stay-at-home parent into the search bar. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe proof that I wasn't imagining things. Maybe just a number. Something measurable in a world that kept pretending what I did didn't count. The articles I found were detailed and validating. Economists had broken it down into services: childcare, meal prep, cleaning, transportation, emotional development, education, logistics management. Each one had a rate. Each one had a real, taxable value. I sat there stunned, realizing that if someone else were hired to do what I did daily, they would charge over $100,000 a year. And that was at the low end, not accounting for overtime, night shifts, or the fact that I didn't get sick days. I copied the numbers into a spreadsheet, not because I planned to show anyone yet, but because I needed to see them laid out. I needed to believe it myself. For the next 2 weeks, I documented every single thing I did, every diaper changed, every snack prepared, every educational game played, every tantrum diffused. I tracked loads of laundry, square footage cleaned, hours spent researching developmental milestones, and the number of nights I got less than 4 hours of sleep. It felt obsessive, maybe even absurd, but it also felt necessary. I wasn't trying to prove a point yet. I was trying to rebuild a truth that had been chipped away one Sunday at a time. I began calculating. The numbers climbed. A nanny for twins, 5 days a week, $2,000 a month. A part-time preschool program with learning components, $2,500. A house cleaner, 2 times a week, $800. Groceries planned and prepared into balanced meals. Another $1,500. Laundry, errands, organizing play dates, therapy check-ins, milestone tracking, safety supervision. It added up fast. At night, when Brandon asked how my day was, I gave vague answers like busy or fine. He didn't ask for more, and I didn't offer. I wasn't angry yet. I was just gathering the receipts that no one thought I had. One evening, as I was filling in another row on my tracker, I thought about the last time someone thanked me without me prompting it. I couldn't remember. I tried to picture the last time Teresa looked at me like a mother, not an unpaid assistant in her son's house. That image never existed. Maybe it never would. I thought about telling Brandon what I was doing, but I held back. It felt too fragile, too early to explain to someone who didn't see the cracks in the walls yet. Then came the email. Teresa invited Brandon's siblings over for what she called a family conversation about financial responsibility. She didn't copy me. Brandon showed it to me offhandedly while brushing his teeth, like it was a calendar reminder. "Mom wants to talk about money stuff," he said. "Probably retirement planning or something." I knew better. The tone in that message wasn't planning. It was judgment. She'd done it before, always disguised as concern. And this time, it felt like she was preparing an intervention that only I wasn't invited to. The meeting was scheduled for Sunday afternoon, the same time the twins usually napped. I rearranged our routine to make it work. I made snacks, straightened the living room, and made sure the twins were calm enough to stay in the playroom with a neighbor for an hour. When they arrived, the mood was polite but tense. Teresa began by voicing her concerns about unnecessary expenses, glancing at me every few sentences, but never addressing me directly. She said Brandon was overworked, that she worried about how one income was being stretched, that perhaps it was time to reconsider our family model. I felt something click inside me, not rage, not sadness, just finality, like I'd heard enough, like the data I had been collecting had finally earned its moment. I didn't interrupt her. I waited until she finished. Then I stood, walked to the hallway where my laptop was charging, and came back with it open to the spreadsheet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply said, "Since the topic today is finances, I'd like to share the unpaid balance I've been carrying." Then I passed the laptop around the room. The numbers did what my words never could. When I passed the laptop around the room, no one spoke at first. They scrolled. They blinked. A few cleared their throats. The spreadsheet was color-coded and categorized childcare, household management, food prep, education, emotional support, logistics. Each task had hours logged, a rate per service, and a total value. At the bottom, I had included a monthly summary with a polite note. "This is not a request for payment. This is a reflection of unpaid labor provided consistently for over 2 years." The silence in that moment was louder than any insult I had ever heard. No one looked at me directly, not even Brandon. He rubbed his chin like he was reading a contract, and Teresa adjusted her scarf twice, which she only did when she was trying not to lash out. When the laptop came back to me, I closed it gently, set it down beside me, and said, "Now we can talk about money." Teresa was the first to speak. That's a very dramatic way to make a point. "Jessica," her voice was calm, but the kind of calm that breaks things in half. "No one is questioning that you help with the children, but it's important to understand that every family has to make sacrifices. This spreadsheet," she said, gesturing vaguely, "makes it sound like you're doing everything on your own." I kept my expression neutral. "I'm not saying I do everything. I'm saying I do a lot, and for the past 2 years, I've been made to feel like it doesn't count." Evelyn shifted uncomfortably. She had 3 kids and a full-time job and often spoke about how hard it was to juggle both. She didn't say anything, but her silence didn't feel dismissive this time. It felt like recognition. Brandon stayed quiet. He didn't defend me, but he also didn't dismiss me. And in that moment, that was enough to tell me he wasn't ready to take a side. He wasn't ready to admit that his mother had been wrong, or that he had allowed this dynamic to grow roots, but he wasn't denying it either. That small shift mattered. Teresa changed tactics. No one asked you to stay home. Jessica, that was your decision. And frankly, a privilege many women don't have. I nodded. It was a choice. But choosing something doesn't mean it stops being work. And it definitely doesn't mean it stops being valuable. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tremble. I had spent too many nights preparing for this moment, even if I hadn't known exactly what form it would take. This is the only room I've ever had to justify being in. I added, I just wanted to show what that room costs. The meeting fizzled after that. No one had the appetite to continue. They left in a staggered trickle, awkward goodbyes and lingering glances. Brandon walked them out while I put the twins to bed. My hand shook slightly as I buttoned Olive's pajamas. Not from fear, from adrenaline. I had said it. I had put years of unseen effort into numbers and presented them without apology. Later that night, Brandon came into the kitchen where I was finishing dishes and leaned against the counter. That was a lot, he said. I didn't look up. Was it? He exhaled. I just think maybe it embarrassed my mom. I turned to face him. She embarrassed me for 2 years. And you let her. He didn't argue. He didn't storm out. He just stood there like a man beginning to understand the shape of a storm he'd never prepared for. The next few days were brittle. Brandon didn't bring up the spreadsheet again. Teresa didn't call. Evelyn sent a one-line text that read, I didn't realize. That was it. But it was more than I'd expected. What I hadn't anticipated was the sense of lightness that followed. It wasn't joy or relief exactly, but a kind of emotional exhale I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't waiting for approval anymore. I wasn't begging to be seen. I had made my case. And if they chose to ignore it, that was no longer my burden. I spent more time with the twins that week, just playing without documenting or tracking. I let the house stay a little messy. I stopped folding laundry with precision and started letting myself sit on the floor for story time without checking the clock. Then, 5 days later, Teresa emailed me, not Brandon, me. It was curt, carefully worded, and included phrases like deeply regret any unintended offense and open to further conversation when appropriate. It wasn't an apology. It was a legal disclaimer disguised as kindness. I didn't reply. I didn't need to, because this wasn't about making her change. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I had allowed to get chipped away by silence, by politeness, by guilt. And what surprised me most wasn't the confrontation. It was how quiet the aftermath felt. Not because nothing changed, but because something inside me had finally settled. The next morning, Brandon made the coffee without asking how I slept. He poured me a cup and set it down gently, the way someone places flowers on a grave. We moved through breakfast like co-workers sharing a kitchen in silence. The twins were loud enough to fill the space between us, but there was a shift in the air that felt heavier than anything they said. I noticed it first when he hesitated before checking his phone, like he didn't want to see his mother's name, and later that evening, when he came home earlier than usual. I realized he had stayed back to avoid the calls altogether. He didn't admit it, but I could tell. 3 days later, he asked if I still had the invoice. I opened my laptop, pulled up the file, and slid it across the table. He didn't say a word for several minutes. He scrolled through each column like it was the first time he had seen it, even though he'd been in the room when it was passed around. "You logged everything," he finally said. I nodded. Not for them, for me. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. Instead, he asked if I had ever thought about turning it into something bigger. A blog, maybe, a workshop, something other mothers could use. The question surprised me more than the silence ever had. That night, after the twins were asleep, we talked for real. No one raised their voice. No one cried. But the honesty stung more than either of us expected. I told him I felt abandoned every time he stayed quiet, while his mother cut me down in our own home. I told him how many nights I had replayed those conversations alone, wondering if I was really as fragile or dramatic as she made me feel. He sat through all of it. No defense, no excuses. Then he told me something I hadn't expected to hear. I grew up being told that my dad didn't do enough, that everything my mom did was because she had to carry the family. I guess I believed her version of work always mattered more. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first time I saw him question the foundation of what he'd been raised to believe. That moment mattered more than I realized, because from that day on, he started noticing the things I had stopped pointing out. When Teresa sent him an article about women wasting their potential by staying home, he didn't share it with me. He deleted it. When she called during dinner to ask why we hadn't RSVP'd for another extended family lunch at her place, he told her we weren't available. Without looking at me for permission or backup, it was subtle, but it was a change. One Sunday, instead of our usual visit, we took the twins to the park and stayed until sunset. I didn't ask if he had told his mom we wouldn't be coming. I didn't need to. That night, as I folded laundry and he packed lunches for the next day, he looked at me and said, "I never realized how many things just happened around me without me doing anything." I smiled, not to dismiss the comment, but because it was the first time I'd heard him say something that didn't center around his work or his exhaustion. It was the first time he acknowledged that his life ran smoother because someone else was paying attention to the details he never thought about. It didn't erase the years before, but it opened something new between us. Not a clean slate, but a better language, one built on the recognition of what had always been there, waiting to be named. Still, change with Teresa was slower. Her Sunday visits became less frequent, and when she did come, they were shorter, less critical. She brought store-bought cookies instead of judgment. And though her compliments were still measured, she at least addressed me by name instead of title. I didn't expect a dramatic transformation. I had stopped hoping for that a long time ago, but I noticed the way Brandon watched her now, as if assessing the tone of her remarks, not just their surface. And when she made a comment one afternoon about how some women just don't have the stamina for a full-time career in parenting, he put down his fork and calmly said, "Sarah's job is harder than mine most weeks. You just don't see it." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The point wasn't to argue. It was to interrupt the pattern. That night, as I rocked Caleb back to sleep after a bad dream, I found myself humming the same lullaby my mother used to sing. My eyes scanned the room, from the nightlight to the stack of books to the carefully labeled bins. All of it was built slowly, without applause, without validation, but it was solid. It was real. And finally, I wasn't the only one who saw it. About a week after that quiet shift in our household, something unexpected happened. Veronica, Brandon's cousin's wife, messaged me out of the blue We'd spoken maybe twice at family events and exchanged the usual surface-level pleasantries. But her message was different. She said she had heard about the spreadsheet and asked if I would be willing to share a blank version of it. She and a few friends from her parenting group wanted to start tracking their own unpaid labor. I hesitated before replying, not because I didn't want to help, but because I wasn't sure if it would be received the way I intended. I told her yes, and I attached a cleaned-up version without names. Along with a short note about why I made it, she replied within an hour, saying it was brilliant and thanked me for helping her finally put numbers to a part of her life no one ever acknowledged. I didn't realize it then, but that message opened a door. Over the next few days, more messages trickled in. A woman named Kira from Veronica's group reached out and asked if she could quote my calculations in a support post. Another woman, a friend of Brandon's former coworker, asked if I could help her build her own invoice to show her partner during counseling. These were strangers, women I had never met, living entirely different lives, but every one of them carried the same invisible weight, the same exhaustion, the same internal battle of doing so much and constantly being made to feel like it was never enough. For the first time in years, I felt connected again, not just to my children or to Brandon, but to something wider, something rooted in shared understanding. I started a private online group, just a small circle of women from these conversations. We weren't influencers. We weren't perfect, but we showed up for each other in ways that felt honest. We shared what we tracked, what we let go, what we couldn't say out loud to our partners or in-laws or friends who still didn't understand. We laughed over screenshots of passive-aggressive family group chats. We raged over dismissive comments like, "Must be nice to stay home." But mostly, we reminded each other that what we did mattered, that it had value, even when no one said thank you. Around that same time, a friend from my old nonprofit days reached out. Lauren had been a policy lead on our education campaigns before she moved into family advocacy. She said she'd seen the invoice through someone who forwarded it to her. She asked if I would allow an anonymized version to be used in a series of workshops about economic recognition for unpaid caregivers. I remember reading her message while standing at the sink, still holding a half-washed sippy cup. It felt surreal, like the work I had done in the shadows of my own house had somehow reached a stage I never asked for. I said yes, not because I wanted credit, but because I wanted someone else to feel seen sooner than I had been. Meanwhile, things between me and Brandon continued to change, not dramatically, but steadily. He started doing things he never used to notice. He packed snacks for outings without asking. He sat through pediatric appointments and remembered the details. He even took a personal day just to be home, without waiting for an emergency to justify it. One night, I came into the living room and found him reading a post in our small support group. I hadn't sent it to him. He had asked for the link quietly a few days earlier. When he saw me, he said, "I just wanted to understand more." I think that moment meant more than the spreadsheet, because information can explain, but willingness to learn is something else entirely. He wasn't just defending me now. He was doing the slower work of unlearning what he'd assumed was normal. As spring approached, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not victory, not closure, but restoration, like the slow stitching together of fabric that had been worn thin. The house hadn't changed. The twins still scattered toys from one room to the next, like it was their mission. The laundry still piled up faster than I could fold. But I was moving through it differently, with a kind of quiet dignity I hadn't felt in years, not because anyone handed it to me, but because I had taken it back. And as strange as it sounds, all of it started with that sentence she said, like it meant nothing. You're just the babysitter. Sometimes it takes being reduced to the wrong label to finally claim the right one. A few weeks after Lauren reached out, I started waking up with a different kind of clarity. It wasn't that my days were suddenly easier. The twins still woke before sunrise, still demanded snacks the second I sat down, still needed every ounce of me. But something inside had shifted. I no longer moved through the house like a ghost fulfilling invisible obligations. I was still tired, still stretched thin, but I wasn't shrinking. I noticed it in the way I spoke to people, even in casual interactions. I no longer downplayed what I did or made jokes about just staying home. When people asked what I did for a living, I said it plainly. I manage a household, I raise 2 children, and I do unpaid labor that would bankrupt most families if outsourced. That sentence didn't always land well. Some people blinked awkwardly or changed the subject, but others, mostly women, nodded slowly like they'd been waiting to hear someone else say it first. I started writing again during the twins' nap times. Nothing big, just small essays about the emotional math of motherhood. I wrote about what it felt like to run on fumes while being told you had it easy. I wrote about being talked over in your own kitchen, about folding tiny clothes while your former colleagues presented strategies you once helped design. The writing wasn't angry. It was clear, measured. The way I used to write before sleep deprivation and dinner prep swallowed most of my language. I posted one of those essays anonymously in a caregiving forum Lauren invited me to, and it got more responses than I expected, not likes or hearts, but long paragraphs from strangers who had never seen my face but knew my feelings down to the bone. One woman wrote, "I thought it was just me, questioning my worth in a house I built with my own exhaustion." Another said, "I printed your post and left it on the counter." My husband finally saw me that night. I read those replies in silence, one hand still on the twins' monitor, and felt a deep, grounding ache. Not the kind that hurts, but the kind that reminds you you're not as alone as you feared. Brandon saw the shift too. He didn't say much at first, but I caught him watching me differently, as if reevaluating a painting he'd walked past for years without noticing the details. One evening, while I was editing another essay, he sat beside me and asked if I would ever consider publishing a book. I laughed. The idea felt both absurd and distant, but something about the way he asked made me pause. "Maybe," I said, but not for anyone's approval, just to remember I had something to say. Meanwhile, Teresa's contact with us remained civil, but limited. She still dropped off gifts for the twins occasionally, but she no longer lingered or offered unsolicited parenting advice. Brandon told me privately that he had spoken to her more directly than he ever had before. He didn't share the exact words, and I didn't ask. What mattered more was that I no longer had to explain why it hurt. He had finally seen it for himself. And with that shift came new boundaries, quiet ones. No more unannounced visits, no more comments that slid under the radar. The rules had changed, not through confrontation, but through clarity. What surprised me most during that time was how quickly guilt tried to creep back in. Guilt for creating space, guilt for writing instead of vacuuming, guilt for saying no to things that used to be automatic yeses. But every time it returned, I reminded myself what it had cost to get here. I had paid with sleep, silence, and the erasure of my own identity. Reclaiming even a fraction of that wasn't selfish. It was overdue. And more than anything, I wanted my daughter to grow up knowing that care work is not lesser work, and my son to understand that strength includes recognition, not dismissal. That became my compass. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was restoration. It was building something new, not from the ruins, but from the pieces I had been holding all along. And I didn't need anyone to clap. I just needed to keep going. Summer came slowly that year, as if the season itself was hesitant to shift, unsure if the soil had softened enough for something new to grow. But inside our home, change was already taking root. Brandon started making room for my writing without me having to justify it. On some mornings, he'd take the twins to the park just so I could have an hour of quiet with my thoughts. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was deliberate, and that made all the difference. The kind of support that doesn't announce itself but shows up anyway is the kind that holds. By then, my writing had reached a few other spaces. A nonprofit shared one of my posts on their newsletter with credit. And a local parenting podcast asked if I wanted to speak anonymously about the emotional labor of motherhood. I declined the interview but agreed to send a written piece, which they read on air. I listened to it in the kitchen while making lunch. The voice of a stranger speaking my words back to me, and for a moment I felt something settle deep in my chest. Not pride. Exactly. More like relief. The kind that comes when the truth is finally said aloud and no one interrupts it. Teresa didn't mention the podcast, but I know she heard it. Veronica told me someone had forwarded it to the family chat, and that there was a lot of silence afterward. That was fine by me. I wasn't looking for approval from the same people who had once tried to erase me. What mattered more was the way Olive looked at me now when I said I was working. "You're writing stories that help other mommies," she said one afternoon while coloring beside me. I smiled and nodded, thinking how powerful it is for a child to see care and creativity as work that counts. Then, one Sunday, after weeks of distance, Teresa stopped by unannounced. I opened the door with hesitation, already rehearsing polite deflections. But she surprised me. She was holding a small envelope and a container of soup. "For the kids," she said, handing me both. I thanked her and waited for the usual correction or critique, but it never came. She looked around the living room, which was its usual mild chaos, and said softly, "They're growing so fast. You've done a good job. It wasn't flowery, it wasn't rehearsed, but it was the closest thing to respect I had ever heard from her. I didn't trust it yet, but I didn't dismiss it either." We sat for 15 minutes. She asked how I was. I answered honestly but simply. When she left, she paused at the door and added, "Brandon told me what you wrote. I didn't realize how much I contributed to the way you felt." She didn't apologize, but she named it. That alone felt like a new beginning, even if it would take time to become anything more. What I learned in those months was that restoration doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it's just the absence of harm. Sometimes it's having your boundaries respected without a fight. And sometimes it's knowing that even if someone never fully gets it, they finally stop trying to argue with your reality. That was enough for me. I continued writing. I continued mothering. And I continued doing the thousands of invisible things that made our home function without needing anyone to clap for them. But now, I saw myself doing them. I tracked my own value, not in spreadsheets anymore, but in the steadiness of my own breath, the steadiness of knowing I no longer had to prove anything to people who had once called me less. The strange thing is, once you stop needing their approval, you start noticing how many others needed someone to go first. I started getting letters from women in other states, other countries even, who said they had printed the invoice and used it in their own conversations. One woman told me her teenage daughter now wanted to study economics to understand unpaid labor. Another said she finally found the words to explain to her partner why she felt like she was drowning in plain sight. What started as a survival instinct had become a ripple, and I didn't need to stand at the center of it to feel proud. I was content knowing that maybe one woman out there would be spared years of doubt because someone told the truth in a way that was calm, real, and impossible to dismiss. The day I realized I no longer felt angry was a quiet Tuesday. The kids were painting. Brandon was vacuuming without being asked. And I was editing a new essay. The sun came in through the kitchen window just right, catching the streaks on the fridge and the crumbs on the counter. And for the first time, those imperfections didn't feel like failures. They felt like proof that something was working, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. By the time autumn arrived, the air in our house felt different. It wasn't louder or busier, but more grounded, like everything had finally found its right weight. The kids were more independent, and I had more windows of quiet in the day to reflect, write, and actually think without interruption. Brandon and I no longer danced around subjects like we used to. When we were tired, we said it. When we needed help, we asked for it. And when something hurt, we named it. Not to blame, but to understand each other more clearly. There was no great epiphany, no movie-style resolution, just steady, grown-up work, the kind that rebuilds what used to be assumed, but now was chosen intentionally. Teresa came over once that season, this time by invitation. It was the twins' birthday, and I had decided, for the first time, that the party would be exactly what we wanted. Simple, messy, kid-focused, no forced traditions, no performative hostessing, just joy. She arrived with a modest gift bag and a quiet demeanor. No comments about the balloons not matching. No questions about why the cake was store-bought. She even helped clean up after, asking first if I needed a hand. I don't know what shifted in her, and I didn't ask. I just noted the absence of judgment and let that be the gift. At one point during the party, while the kids were running in circles and the noise filled the living room, she stood beside me at the kitchen counter. She looked at me for a long second before saying, "They're lucky to have a mother who notices the little things." That was it. No long speech, no apology for the years she hadn't said it, but I heard the truth beneath her words. Maybe it had taken her watching from the sidelines to see what I had carried all along. Or maybe Brandon had finally shown her a version of me she hadn't allowed herself to see before. Whatever the reason, I accepted it not as validation, but as recognition. Quiet and late, but real. That evening, after everyone left and the dishes were done, I took a walk alone. It was something I rarely did. But that night I needed to feel the air without anyone needing something from me. I walked past the houses of neighbors I barely knew, past swing sets and porches and windows lit up with other versions of family. I thought about how many women were sitting on couches like mine, holding exhaustion and resentment in their bones, while smiling through bedtime routines. How many had never spoken aloud what they carried? How many had been called just a babysitter and swallowed it whole? I stopped by a park bench and checked the group chat I had started months earlier. There were new messages. One woman had used the invoice to negotiate a different custody agreement. Another had printed her version and left it on her mother-in-law's dining table with a thank you note. The stories weren't always triumphant. Some had backlash. Some got silence. But none of them were invisible anymore. That was enough. When I got home, Brandon was reading on the couch. He looked up and asked, "Good walk?" I nodded and sat beside him. We didn't need to say much. The silence was comfortable now, no longer full of unsaid things. I leaned my head on his shoulder, and he rested his hand on mine. That simple gesture reminded me that progress in a relationship doesn't always look like grand gestures or perfect understanding. Sometimes it's just being present, fully, without defense. Later that week, I got a message from a woman who had stumbled on one of my essays through a parenting forum. She said she had never thought of her home life in economic terms, never even considered how much she did until she saw it mapped out. "You helped me stop apologizing for being tired," she wrote. I sat with that sentence longer than I expected, because I remembered what it felt like to apologize for things that were never wrong to begin with, for being tired, for asking for help, for needing to be seen. I no longer apologized for any of it, and maybe that was the real win. Not changing others, not fixing broken dynamics, but refusing to erase myself for the sake of peace that never protected me anyway. That invoice I made months ago now sits in a folder on my desktop. I haven't opened it in weeks. I don't need to anymore, because now, when I look in the mirror, I see someone who values her own labor, even if the world forgets to. And that, more than anything, is what I want my children to remember. It's been almost a year since I sent that invoice, and sometimes I still can't believe I had the nerve to do it. Not because I regret it, but because of how much had to build up inside me before I was willing to call what I did valuable. I think back to those early days, exhausted, unsure, spinning through the haze of sleepless nights and invisible labor when I honestly believed I had to earn the right to be respected in my own home. I spent so long shrinking myself, trying to fit a version of motherhood that looked effortless, quiet, and grateful, as if love alone could somehow justify being dismissed. Now I understand something deeper. Love is not the opposite of worth. It doesn't replace it, and it shouldn't be used as a reason to ignore the cost of giving everything without recognition. I still do the same work. I still wake up early and fold laundry and wipe crayon off walls. I still soothe nightmares and cut grapes into quarters and explain feelings to toddlers who can't yet name their own. But I do it with a different spine now, not harder, just straighter, because I know what it takes to keep a life running smoothly from behind the curtain. I know how much value lives in the quiet things no one claps for. Brandon and I are still learning. There are moments when the old patterns sneak in, moments when I feel the urge to over-explain or justify something simple. But those moments pass quicker now because we've built better muscle memory. We both understand that support isn't about heroics. It's about presence. It's about asking how someone is and actually listening to the answer. It's about walking into a room and noticing the unpaid labor that made it livable in the first place. Teresa hasn't changed overnight, but I don't expect her to. The truth is, I'm not waiting for her to become someone else anymore. I've stopped needing her approval to feel valid, and that shift has made our relationship oddly lighter. When we do talk, it's brief, civil, and far less performative. There's a distance now, but it's one I can live with, because I no longer feel like I'm trying to prove something to a woman who built her identity on denying others the right to feel overwhelmed. My children are growing fast, too fast. Sometimes I catch them saying phrases I didn't know I used, comforting each other in ways that reflect the emotional language we've worked hard to teach them. That, more than anything, reminds me why this journey mattered, because what we model is what they absorb. And I want them to know that care is not weakness, that emotional labor is real labor, and that dignity doesn't require a paycheck to be deserved. The support group I started still meets online. We don't always talk about heavy things. Sometimes we just laugh about messes, or share quick recipes, or vent about the fifth tantrum before noon. But there's something powerful about a space where you don't have to explain why you're tired, a place where your work is already understood before you open your mouth. That space didn't exist for me before I cracked. Now, it's a room I help hold open for others. Looking back, I don't think the invoice was the point. It was just the tool that made the invisible visible. What changed my life wasn't a list of services or hourly rates. It was the moment I stopped begging to be seen and started naming my own worth out loud. That moment created a ripple, not just in my family, but in me. I no longer wait for someone to say thank you before I believe what I did mattered. I've been asked if I would do it again. The answer is yes. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Sometimes, to change the conversation, you have to start by changing how you speak about yourself, not louder, just clearer. And sometimes, the clearest thing you can say is, "This has value. So do I." If you've ever felt unseen in your own life, if you've ever questioned whether what you do is enough simply because no one noticed, I hope you take one thing from my story. You don't need permission to define your worth. You don't need applause to validate your effort. And you are not just anything. The most important recognition of your value should come from within. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't help others see it too. Have you ever had to make someone acknowledge the weight of what you do not with anger, but with truth? Let me know in the comments. You're not alone.